Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Wills and Probate podcast. Today we're talking about culture, retention, staff retention, how we can improve staff welfare, working practices, and ultimately the connection between the culture of a business and its risk profile. I hope I'm doing that justice, Andre. I've got Andre Thomas of Thomas Telman here on the podcast with me to discuss the topic. Thank you so much for joining.
It's a pleasure. Good to be here, David. Thanks for inviting me.
Founder of Thomas Telman, tell us about the business, tell us about yourself and your journey in the first instance, please, Andre.
Okay, certainly. So, yes, my name is Andre. I'm founder of Thomas Telman. We are management consultants that specialize in working with law firms and accountancy practices and sort of sharing with them and how they can go about developing a workplace culture that allows them to attract and retain their best people. How did I get here? It wasn't by design, actually. What happened was that I was a headhunter, and I used to headhunt investment bankers, and then I pivoted in 2019 because I realized that there were a lot of issues that law firms were having with regards to attracting and retaining talent, and particularly with regards to retaining talent. So they had cultural issues. See, when I started Thomas Telman, we were actually doing legal recruitment, and then I then realized, there's a bigger problem that needs to be solved here, which was a cultural issue. And cut long story short, I pivoted pretty much in the middle of COVID, around 2021, 2022 time. And ever since then, I have been talking, writing and advising law firms mainly, and now recently accounting firms on how they can go about elevating their workplace culture so that they can ultimately attract and retain the best people and improve profits.
I think most listeners to the podcast would concur that recruitment and retention is either their number one or certainly up there in terms of one of their biggest challenges. No doubt a conversation at every partners meeting. Why? What are we getting wrong, very specifically in professional services and the law, of course, that is making this such a challenge for us as organizations?
In my humble experience, it's that for many firms, they don't take culture as seriously as they should. And that's partly because of lack of definition as to what culture is and how you can go about measuring it. And therefore, if you can't measure it, how can you develop it, right? But what we do know is that we can, when we walk into an environment that isn't right, we can feel the difference between, an environment that feels good and an environment that feels bad. So it's nebulous. And that's why it makes it really challenging for leaders to say, right, well, you know what, we need a better culture. This culture isn't right. How are we going to go about fixing it? So I think that's the long and short of it, in my view, as to why it's so challenging.
Well, I can't let you leave it there. Let's drill into what culture for you is. And I guess I'm thinking here about all the boasts that those big tech companies, the likes of Google, made when they opened those offices with slides and beanbags and sleep pods. But they didn't last a huge amount of time, did they? In fact, I remember reading that they got rid of them, probably within a couple of years from memory.
Yeah. Because like having table tennis tables and pool tables and lovely fluffy pillows on the floor for people to sit and relax. Yeah, that, aesthetically that looks nice, and it's maybe pleasing, if you can finish your lunch a little early and play a game of table tennis. But ultimately, that is not really what forms your culture. You see, quite often I think firms say, look, you know what, we have our values up on the wall. These are what our values are. But again, that doesn't really identify what culture you have. To identify really what culture you have, you need to understand what the employee experience is. And so once you know that, well, that's the culture that you have. And if it so happens that everybody within the firm, or at least a high percentage of the people within the firm, are engaged and they feel that the culture is fantastic and it's all that is said on the tin, then brilliant. Your values match what actually people are feeling and experiencing, then fantastic. But quite often, the problem is that your values say one thing and your people saying another. And where you have that disparity, then you've got a problem that needs investigating.
You talked about measuring culture, and I want to come onto that in just a second. But before I do, how do these cultures manifest if they're not right, if they are the words on the wall, but we're not living and breathing it?
Well, if you're not living and breathing it, living and breathing those values that you say that are, intrinsic to the way how we work as an organization, then you are certainly at risk of a toxic culture emerging and potentially taking root. And so hence the reason why it's important that you are looking to understand, well, what culture do we have? It keeps your finger on the pulse as to, making sure that, we understand if we need to increase salaries, for instance. We need to increase salaries because, our people are telling us that that's what is required, and we're going to go about doing that. But quite often, initiatives in terms of, your people initiatives, benefits, etc., are implemented like the table tennis tables and the soft cushions on the floor, not actually knowing what your people really want and need to allow them to thrive. And quite often it's actually not what you think.
What does a toxic workplace look like in your view?
Breakdown of communication, silos appearing, people not feeling psychologically safe. They can't be themselves at work. Managers and leadership is saying one thing, but the reality on the ground is that it's different. Therefore, trust has broken down. Those signs are then lead into high turnover of staff, bad reviews, low engagement, higher recruitment costs. So, all of these things culminate ultimately to potentially damaging one's employer brand.
I think one of the telling things that I think about with regard to that kind of culture is the knock-on impact it has on risk, people's efficiency at work. If you think, a happy worker is a healthy worker, less time off sick, they're probably less likely to make mistakes. And in that sort of high pressure role that lawyers are in, and if you think particularly about the demographics that we as a publication serve, conveyancing, wills and probate and family, they are all sectors in which errors lead to potential claims.
Absolutely. Totally true. People need to feel comfortable that they can make errors, right? That they can speak up, and they're not going to get their head shot off. It's important that people feel psychologically safe so that there is an environment where they can make errors and it can be forgiven. Of course, I know, some errors are bigger than others, and you want people to learn from their mistakes, right? But then if you've got a problem with some individuals not necessarily doing what they should, then you'd also question your hiring strategy. Are you hiring the right people in the first place?
Let's move on to that question about how we measure this, because I think there's a lot of lovely words here. As we say, we've got lots of sentiment. We're feeling quite good about ourselves, but what gets measured gets done. It's the old adage, isn't it?
That's right.
How do we measure this?
Well, it begins by conducting engagement surveys. It's one of the, believe it or not, you'd be surprised the amount of firms that don't actually do that, even on a yearly basis. When you're conducting surveys, what questions are being asked? To when you're measuring culture, believe it or not, there's 15 different data points. Some of the key ones will be career development, psychological safety, how often people are off ill from work, retention rate, recruitment costs. So yeah, there's 15 in total. You need to use surveys. Great space, a great place to start. What that's going to give you an indication of is, what percentage of people like the workplace culture, right? So you're gathering quantitative data. So it's going to give you some numbers. The next stage of understanding, or certainly measuring your culture, is to then run focus groups. What focus groups allows you to do is to get a bit deeper into what people are experiencing. So you can ask open questions in groups of maybe 8 to 10, and you can start understanding why people answer in a particular way. And then if you want to go deeper further, you can then start conducting one-to-one interviews. All of this together is gathering quantitative and qualitative data and analyzing the data to understand, well, what is the employee experience? And as I said earlier, it's the employee experience that determines what culture you have and why. And once you know that, then you can start asking some really interesting questions, such as, well, is this the culture that we want? Is this the culture that we like? Is this a culture that's going to help us accelerate growth? What do we need to change, et cetera, et cetera? In order for you to be able to gather all of that data, what's needed is that people need to feel that they can be open and honest in their answers, right? So there needs to be at least an element of trust. Certainly, if you're doing this internally. I suppose one of the big benefits of doing a culture audit, if you like, is using an external organization to do it, because then at least you hope that your people will be honest and open to an external organization, as opposed to, some of the senior leaders within the firm, right? So that's how you go about measuring it.
It won't surprise me to know how few firms are doing engagement surveys, if I'm completely honest with you, Andre, because obviously you and I have chatted and I know the statistics around it. But again, going back to what we've said in the past about professional services, it's quite challenging to change cultures in those organizations, isn't it? When you've done that work and you've gone through that methodology that you've just outlined, what are the common pitfalls and mistakes that you see firms are making? What sort of trends are there that people listening to this can go, actually, maybe that's something we need to be thinking about?
You've identified that there's a problem with our culture. We've dug a little bit deeper. We've gathered some data as to what our employee experience is. And now what, right? So what's important is that, and I've often seen this in the past, is that data isn't revealed. The data isn't shared because it's, it's too sensitive. But I think that, with something like this, it's important, I think, to share the data with your employees. It shows that you're being transparent. It shows that, look, we all make mistakes. We're human. We all get things wrong. But at least if you demonstrate, look, what, we actually, we want to put things right. We've not done things the way how we would like. And so it's important that we share the data. So that's the first thing, share it. And then it's about understanding, okay, well, what is it that we're going to try and improve if we feel that there's things that needs fixing? And it's sticking to those decisions and those milestones. So having a plan as to what needs to be achieved. And quite often, David, what I've found is that in professional services, people that get promoted to manage teams are usually technically very good at what they do, right? Tend to have quite a high IQ. That's what got them the position in the first place, etc. But what takes you from being a good technical gifted individual to being a leader of people requires another set of skills. And I describe this as emotional intelligence. This is, how do you bring intelligence to your emotions? Because people leave managers, not jobs. That's what managers and team leaders need to develop, particularly in the world that we live in today, where artificial intelligence is literally transforming the way how we work. What's going to separate human from a robot is our emotions, how we develop other people, how we can connect with other people and develop relationships. We need to understand our own emotions first so that we can identify and help other people that are in particular states, and what to do to help them.
Presumably, and forgive me if I'm wrong here, Andre, there are certain core characteristics or core things as organizations we should be doing in order to embed a good, positive culture. You're nodding along. Tell me about some of those things. What do we need to be thinking about that is the sort of bedrock of what we can build from?
Brilliant. Love the question. You have to start looking at your recruitment. All right. You have to look at, who are we hiring? You could have the wrong people in your organization in positions that shouldn't really be in those roles, which is going to make it so much more difficult to try and fix culture. So, it is what it is. You are where you are. So before you start recruiting again, get a handle of what's going on internally, what culture you have, etc., and then start looking at, are we actually hiring the right people? And then look at the recruitment process. How are we onboarding them? Is that aligned with the values that we have? I've seen it. Solicitors will join a firm within 3 months. They don't even know that many people within the firm. And the firm could only be 50, 60 people. There's the integration of people within the firm is not great. Personal development plans, another area where firms seem to fall down. And these are the things that people feel that are important. And so you need to have recruitment, onboarding, performance management systems and processes in place, and the way how you exit people as well. All of that is really important, and it is critical to understanding and making sure that you develop the right culture within the firm.
We're a completely remote organization, Andre, today, as today's media. We have learnt a lesson around onboarding, and you talked there about the importance of onboarding, but the difference between remote onboarding and in-person onboarding. And certainly our experience is that it feels like it takes a lot longer to embed a new employee remotely than it does in person. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, it is 100% more difficult, but not impossible. And obviously it's important just to have, it's the communication and, the touch points. Of course, if you're remote, it's a little bit more difficult, but I suppose it's important, if you can, to at least, if you are people work within a remote environment, that you do actually come together at particular points throughout the year or throughout the week or throughout the month, so that, as humans, we like interaction, right? It's important to get to know people beyond their job title. This is what helps to create the right kind of environment and the right kind of culture, when you get to know what people like and enjoy outside of the working environment, and it's how you start to develop relationships on a deeper, more meaningful level.
But this is a skill that, as firms, and it plays into culture as well, because you've seen firms starting to encourage staff back to the office. I think we will land somewhere around a hybrid working environment still.
Sure.
I don't think organizations are particularly minded to bring their people back to the office 5 days a week, but they still see value in them being there 3-4 days a week, whatever that might be. So in terms of that shift that COVID enforced, we were in the office 5 days a week before COVID. It does seem as though that has changed the working landscape. How challenging is that from a culture point of view, and how do you help firms deal with that?
Yeah, so massive question, and a very important one, because hybrid was, pre-COVID was unheard of, right? But nevertheless, people always wanted to work from home, right? But it was never something that most companies were prepared to entertain. Maybe the cynic in me would say that for most companies felt that, if their bum's not on the seat and I can't see that, then they're probably not doing the work that they should be doing. But what COVID has taught us is that actually people can be trusted. And you know what? If we give them the opportunity to work from home, what tends to happen is they tend to work longer and harder. So long as the KPIs that you're tracking are outcome based, then potentially it's less risk. It is difficult because, of course, as leaders, we want our people to come together. We like the idea, me included, I like the idea of people being together and learning from one another, etc. But there's also a need to be mindful of the fact that people want to have a more hybrid working relationship. And ultimately, though, David, it's about really having trust. And trust works both ways, right? You need to extend it for it to be received. So I would say to leaders, extend the trust. If you're going to have an hybrid environment or relationship with your employees, have particular ground days, have particular days that you have to come into the office. And this is the plan. This is what we're going to do. It may not necessarily always be work related. Maybe the day we come into the office is the day that we're going to go out, go for a meal or whatever the case might be. It may be the day that you're meeting clients. It could be the day that as a team, you're going to get together and work together. It can be really exciting and it kind of breaks up the week quite nicely. But for it to work effectively, there needs to be trust on both sides. And that's what is difficult to usually try and mend. Yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge dealing with trust because it requires parties to be really reflective on their own behaviors. If they're not prepared to do that, then it becomes very difficult. If you are open to analyzing your own self, you give yourself the opportunity to mend things and to develop relationships in a really positive way.
We were saying before we started recording that to try and do justice to culture and retention and recruitment in a 25-30-minute podcast is going to be quite challenging, but we've rattled through a whole range of different topics there. I think I come away from this thinking about how we can really measure that staff engagement, how we can get a better understanding of the culture that we have, and only by doing that, without paraphrasing too much of what we've said, are we going to be able to make changes that will impact it.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, because look, as I said, I don't think there's a leader that wants to create a toxic culture, right? But nevertheless, toxic cultures exist. They emerge and they take root. To prevent that, or certainly try and mitigate against that, is that you need to have some idea as to what your culture is. Therefore, you need to measure employee engagement. And you need to do that on various levels, because quantitative surveys will only give you what the problem potentially is. Whereas if you dig deeper by doing focus groups and interviews, then we can really get to the root of issues, because then you start to uncover the why. Why do those issues exist? That often requires, specialist skills to facilitate focus groups, etc. It's what I do. And also it requires your people to feel that they can trust the process and know that that whatever they say is confidential, and that they won't be reprimanded, anything like that, if they have to say things that aren't particularly nice. So that's really important element.
Honesty and trust, the bedrock of any relationship. We're out of time. Thanks so much for joining the podcast, Andre. It's been great to have your insight. The Today's Wills and Probate podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on today'swillsandprobate.co.uk. My thanks to Andre. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at today'swillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.